Patient 526, Isadora Marchesi. Admission, the 25th of March 1902. Age, 19 years. Initial diagnosis, severe somnambulism with episodes of murmuring in unknown tongues. History, Isadora was found wandering the streets near the asylum, with blooded feet and a vacant expression. Each night, her nocturnal walks lead her to the basement of the building, where she marks the floor with strange symbols, even while asleep. She claims to be guided by voices from the abyss, but she cannot recall her actions upon waking. Additional notes: though initially calm, Isadora has become hostile towards staff attempting to intervene in her rituals. Her eyes shine abnormally during episodes. The night was permeated by a suffocating humidity, the kind that clings to the skin like a second layer, making the simple act of breathing a laborious and unsettling task. The streets near the asylum Blackwood, usually serene, now felt drowned in a silence so oppressive that every insignificant sound turned into a muffled scream. It was there, in that uncomfortable twilight, that Isadora appeared. Her body moved like a poorly controlled puppet, each uneven step leaving a trail of blood that marked the dirty cobblestones. The night guard, an experienced man accustomed to the unusual, stood still upon seeing her. Something in the way she moved, or perhaps in her completely vacant expression, seemed to scream that this was not natural. The lantern in his hand trembled, casting shadows that danced grotesquely on the walls. He tried to approach, but stopped a few steps away, paralyzed by an inexplicable feeling that the air around her was colder, denser. Later, he would describe that moment as a silence that pulled me in, as if I were about to fall. When the nurses arrived to fetch her, they hesitated for a brief moment. It was not fear of the unknown, but a primitive instinct, as if something deeply embedded in their brains was warning them to keep their distance. Isadora did not resist the touch, but she did not cooperate either. Her body felt as rigid as a corpse, yet there was a slight vibration that no one could explain. The moment she crossed the doors of the asylum, she murmured something, and the sound, though quiet, seemed to fill the space, reverberating as if the walls were listening. It was not an intelligible phrase, but a series of sounds reminiscent of forgotten words, whispered in a tone that made the listener's spines tingle. When the nurse asked, "Do you know where you are?" the response came, almost as if directed to the void. "The voices brought me here." During the initial examination, Isadora's physical condition began to reveal something beyond a clinical explanation. Her feet, covered in deep, dark cuts, did not seem to cause her pain. She did not complain, did not react, even when the doctors touched the wounds with cold instruments. When one of the assistants lightly pressed her skin, he abruptly recoiled, breathless. His expression was that of someone who had just been burned, but not in a physical way. In the first-floor cell, Isadora was left alone, but the corridors around her seemed to come alive. Guards reported hearing soft and irregular footsteps, always distant enough to be mistaken for echoes, but never close enough to confirm their origin. At 3 in the morning, one of the nurses, unable to sleep, was walking through the ward when he heard something coming from Isadora's cell. He described the sound as layers of overlapping voices, each different, as if several people were trying to speak at the same time, but without forming words. He slowly opened the door and saw Isadora standing still, her fingers pressed against the fogged glass of the window. The marks she had left were not random. They were patterns, intricate symbols that seemed to pulse slightly in the light of the lantern. When the head doctor arrived in the morning, Isadora was still in that position. The dawn light illuminated the symbols on the glass, which now seemed to have depth, as if they were more than just marks on the surface. He asked, in a nearly whispered tone, what it meant. "They wanted me to show," Isadora replied, her voice so low it sounded like a sound coming from another place, almost disconnected from her lips. The records were filled out quickly, but there was something in the reports that seemed to elude rationality. One of the doctors left a note in the margin of his observation, written in a trembling hand that seemed to reflect the state of his mind. "There is something in her that transcends what we can comprehend. To look at her is like seeing something that does not belong to this world, something that should remain hidden." Silence returned to the asylum, but this time, it was different. It was heavy, as if everyone were waiting for something that no one could name. The first days of Isadora at Asylum Blackwood were shrouded in a silence that offered no relief, but rather an oppressive presence, as if the building itself were waiting, watching. Isadora sat on the edge of the bed, her posture motionless, her eyes fixed on the cracked concrete floor, as if reading a hidden message. There was something profoundly unsettling about the way she remained there, still for hours, until her eyes moved slowly, as if following shapes that no one else could see. The air around her seemed heavier, a density that affected anyone who approached. At night, the atmosphere changed. Isadora's cell seemed to transform. Guards reported that the shadows on the walls did not behave as they should. They flickered, cast by an invisible light. It was on the third dawn that the empty cell was discovered. The door was locked, but Isadora had vanished. In the basement, where moisture permeated every surface and the smell of mildew was suffocating, she was found. She was kneeling, her feet bleeding again, leaving marks on the filthy floor. Her blooded fingers moved methodically, drawing patterns so intricate that they seemed to demand something beyond human skill. The guard who found her hesitated before calling her, his voice faltering with nervousness. When the nurses arrived, they hesitated even more. The forms Isadora was tracing seemed to be etched not just on the floor but in their minds, lines that continued even when they closed their eyes. When they finally took her away, Isadora murmured something. Her voice was low, but it seemed to echo in the confined space of the basement, with each syllable carrying a weight that no one could explain. The next day, Isadora appeared completely oblivious to what had happened. When confronted about the symbols, she tilted her head slightly, like a child trying to understand a complicated question, and replied in a calm voice, "They told me to do it." The doctors began to record the events more frequently, but the pattern was always the same. She disappeared at night and reappeared in the basement, where the now spreading symbols seemed connected to something larger. On the fourth night, the episode was more profound, literally. Isadora was found in a part of the basement where even the most experienced guards hesitated to enter. The darkness felt like a living entity, pulsing with an energy that made the skin crawl. The smell of rust and dampness was so strong it felt like it clung to the throat. Isadora was surrounded by symbols that covered not just the floor but now the walls as well, interconnected like a pulsating organism. When the nurses tried to intervene, she reacted for the first time. Her eyes, usually dull, were now lit by a light that seemed to shine from within. And then came the scream. It was not just the sound of a human voice, but something fractured, as if several voices were screaming in unison. They took her back to her cell, but the change was undeniable. Her pulse was racing, her skin covered in a cold sweat, yet her expression was one of complete calm, almost serenity. The doctors, confused, began to question whether they were dealing with something beyond medical understanding. The basement was sealed off the next day, but the sounds did not stop. Guards reported hearing footsteps echoing, even though no one else was there. The symbols Isadora left behind were photographed and recorded, but the patterns were so intricate that they made no sense at all. An employee wrote in his report, "They are not just drawings. They have a purpose. It seems like a map, but to where?" On the sixth night, Isadora disappeared again, despite the barriers imposed on the basement. She was found in the same spot, but this time there was something about her posture that seemed different, something triumphant, almost satisfied. When questioned, she smiled, an empty and disturbing smile, and said, "They need me to finish." The doctors began to discuss the need for physical restraint, but no one could agree. Something in Isadora's eyes made them hesitate. It was as if the idea of confining her was more dangerous than leaving her free. The corridors of the asylum, once silent, were now alive with whispers. Patients screamed in their cells, describing figures they saw in the shadows, figures that were watching. A nurse reported that Isadora appeared in her dreams every night, guiding her through an endless tunnel whose walls were covered with the same symbols that now haunted the basement. Isadora's presence was like an invisible poison, seeping into the minds of those who worked at the asylum. Even those who did not see her directly felt the effects. The basement became more than just a physical space. It became an entity, an epicenter of something that no one could name, but that everyone felt. On the seventh night, the silence of Asylum Blackwood was broken in a way that none of the staff would ever forget. It was not the sound of stealthy footsteps or the screams of patients in agony, but something deeper, more disturbing. A low and constant hum, like the vibrating of a distant bell, resonated through the walls, seeming to come from the very depths below. The sound was not just heard, it was felt, a pulsation that seemed to synchronize with the heartbeats of those who listened, rooting itself in their bones. When one of the guards went down to investigate, the hum seemed to guide him, pulling him into the deeper corridors. But it was on returning to Isadora's cell that he found her. She was sitting in the center of the room, her body rigid, her eyes wide open and fixed on something that no one else could see. Her lips moved slowly, emitting a deep and rhythmic sound, almost like a chant that seemed to come from somewhere between this world and another. The doctors, called in a hurry, decided to record the phenomenon. A phonograph was brought in to capture the unsettling murmur. As the recording was made, the sound that filled the room seemed to grow in intensity, almost as if it was feeding off the attention. When the cylinder was played back the next day, what they found left them astonished. The words, although incomprehensible, had an unmistakable cadence, a structure that suggested a long-lost language, something primitive and alien at the same time. "It's as if the machine itself has captured something we cannot," wrote the attending physician in the records, sealing the cylinder in a safe with trembling hands. The next morning, Isadora seemed different. During breakfast, she refused to eat, completely ignoring the cutlery in front of her. When a nurse tried to insist, the young woman grabbed her arm. The strength of her grip was so unexpected that the woman let out a muffled scream. Isadora's eyes, usually vacant, were fixed on her with an almost predatory intensity. "They are listening now," Isadora said, her voice hoarse and laden with something that seemed to come from a place far beyond her. From that night on, the episodes of sleepwalking intensified. Isadora began to wander through forgotten areas of the asylum, places even the guards avoided. She was found in an abandoned records room, surrounded by boxes of aged documents. She was crouched on the floor, scribbling symbols on a yellowed piece of paper with a piece of charcoal. When the nurses tried to take her back, she screamed. The sound that came from her mouth was so high-pitched and prolonged that it echoed through the corridors, waking patients who began to scream in unison. The doctors, increasingly confused and terrified, began to observe changes in Isadora that they could not explain. During an evaluation session, when asked about the symbols, she laughed. The laugh was not human. It was hollow, as if it came from a bottomless abyss. "They are the key. Can't you see?" she said, tilting her head with a disturbing smile. "It's too late to close the door." The staff began to report strange experiences. Many heard whispers during the night, voices calling their names, but which disappeared the moment they tried to identify the source. Others described recurring nightmares, in which they were guided by Isadora through an infinite tunnel, its walls pulsing with the symbols she drew. On the 10th night, the hum returned, this time louder, almost deafening. Isadora was found in the center of the basement, her arms extended to the sides and her eyes closed. The symbols she had drawn now covered not only the floor but the walls and ceiling. Each line seemed interconnected, forming something that vibrated in the light of the lanterns, almost as if it were alive. When the staff tried to remove her, Isadora opened her eyes. The metallic gleam that emanated from them made everyone stop instantly. It was a gaze that penetrated deeper than flesh, invading the minds of those who stared at her. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, and her voice seemed to echo infinitely in the walls of the basement. Later that night, one of the guards who had been present was found dead in his room. He was sitting in his chair, a vacant smile on his face. There were no signs of violence, but on the table in front of him was a message written in charcoal. "The voices are coming." The basement was sealed again, but no one believed it would make any difference. The whispers, once confined to the basement, now seemed to echo throughout the asylum, a warning that something was about to happen. On the 11th night, the asylum Blackwood no longer seemed like a refuge for restless minds, but an extension of the madness that permeated every corridor, every shadow. Isadora's presence became unbearable, as if her mere existence was a weight that bent the sanity of anyone daring to cross her path. The buzz of the lights flickering incessantly echoed throughout the building, but the doctors and guards knew that it wasn't the generator's fault. Something was collapsing, something invisible yet palpable, and Isadora was the epicenter. As she was led to a more secure cell, her rigid posture and incessant murmurs made the nurses hesitate. A feeling of nausea and headache overcame them as they approached, as if their very bodies reacted to her proximity. When one of the guards tried to hurry her along by touching her arm, she stopped abruptly. Her movement was so calculated and slow that it resembled more of a mechanism than a human reaction. "You shouldn't touch me," she said, slowly turning her head towards the guard. Her voice was low but sharp, cutting like invisible blades. He recoiled, his eyes wide, as Isadora's continuous murmuring filled the silence, now heavier than ever. In the new cell, equipped with reinforced locks, Isadora became something different each night. A nurse assigned to her surveillance reported seeing shadows moving along the walls of her cell. They followed no logical pattern, dancing and contorting into shapes he could not comprehend. In his report, he wrote, "The shadows seemed to watch her, but somehow also watched me. I no longer know what is real." Desperate for an explanation, the doctors began to monitor Isadora more closely. Audio recordings revealed something that surpassed the realm of science. On the 13th night, one of the tapes captured not only her incessant murmurs but also a second voice. Deep, guttural, and intermittent, it seemed to respond to every sentence she murmured, like a dialogue between her and something no one else could see. When the doctors confronted Isadora with the recordings, she laughed. But the laughter was not normal. It was loud, distorted, a sound that reverberated through the hallways and made the other patients scream in despair. "You still don't understand, do you?" she said, with a smile that looked more like an open wound than a human expression. "I am merely the beginning. They are coming." Isadora's physical transformation became undeniable. Her skin appeared translucent, as if a hidden light was trying to emerge from within. Her eyes, permanently glowing, no longer reflected light but seemed to absorb it, devouring whatever approached. Even with the cell locked, the symbols she drew continued to appear, now on the walls and the floor, growing like a disease infecting the space around her. In the basement, guards began to report continuous noises, scratching at the doors, the suffocating smell of ozone that made them tear up, and a constant pulsing that seemed to emanate from the walls. On the 14th day, one of the more skeptical doctors decided to confront her alone, ignoring the warnings of the other staff. He entered the cell with firm steps but hesitated as he felt the air shift, dense, vibrant, almost alive. Isadora was sitting on the floor, drawing with her finger, and did not even glance at him. When he finally questioned her, she replied without taking her eyes off the ground, "They are not trapped." She slowly lifted her gaze, as if wanting to ensure he understood the next sentence. "You are the ones who are." The recording ended abruptly, and the doctor was found unconscious on the cell floor, with the palm of his hand marked by a burned symbol. When he woke up, he refused to speak, repeating only, "Don't look at her. Don't look directly at her." The following days were absolute chaos. The medical records became illegible, mixing rational notes with frantic scribbles. Doctors and guards began to report the same symptoms: hallucinations, shadows following them, and an increasing sense of paranoia. On the 16th night, Isadora's cell was found empty, despite all the locks being intact. She was discovered in the basement, at the center of a formation of symbols that now covered the entire space. The drawings connected like pulsing veins, glowing with an intensity that made those present shrink in fear. She stood there, her eyes shining like two beacons in a living darkness. Without saying a word, she slowly raised her arms towards the ceiling. It was then that the lights in the asylum flickered violently before going out completely. The buzzing returned, now emanating from the very walls of the basement, growing in intensity, until everyone present began to scream. When the lights came back on, Isadora lay on the floor, motionless. But something had changed. The walls of the basement, once static, seemed deeper, wider, as if they had been shaped by something no one could see. The buzzing did not fade away. It merely diminished, like a heavy breath waiting for the next move. The 17th night began like all the others, with a silent tension enveloping Asylum Blackwood like a shroud. But as dawn approached, something changed. The corridors, always cold, were now stiflingly hot, and the air carried a metallic smell, like burnt iron. Isadora had remained motionless for nearly 24 hours, seated in her cell, but her eyes were open, fixed on some distant point that no one could see. When the clock struck 3:17 a.m., a deafening sound echoed through the asylum. It was not a natural sound, neither metallic nor human, but something in between. All the guards reported hearing, at the same time, a buzzing that seemed to vibrate within their bones. That's when the lights began to flicker again, and panic took hold. Isadora was found in the basement. No one could explain how she had exited her locked cell, but when discovered, she was standing in the center of the deepest hall, surrounded by symbols that now covered the entire space, from floor to ceiling. The markings appeared incandescent under the dim light of the lanterns, pulsing in a rhythm that seemed synchronized with the hearts of those observing. The guards hesitated to enter. Something in Isadora's eyes made them instinctively recoil. She didn't seem merely to be there. She seemed to be an extension of the very space, as if the basement of the asylum had been shaped around her. When one of the nurses tried to approach, Isadora raised one hand and whispered something. Her voice was low, but it seemed to resonate in all directions at once. The nurse immediately stopped, eyes wide, and began to tremble before collapsing to his knees. He cried uncontrollably, repeatedly murmuring, "I saw. I saw." The remaining staff decided to act as a group, advancing with a mix of forced courage and desperation. As they got closer, Isadora began to recite something in an unknown language, but her words seemed to dance in the air, creating echoes that distorted the perception of space. The sounds seemed to come from all sides, and many reported feeling as if they were being watched by dozens of invisible eyes. At the climax of the ritual, Isadora fell to her knees and raised her arms to the ceiling. The lantern lights began to flicker violently, and the symbols around her glowed with increasing intensity. When the guards tried to hold her, she opened her eyes, which now shone like a beacon. It was at that moment that the ground began to tremble. The sound that followed seemed to come from the depths of the basement, a roar that no human could produce, mixed with the sound of something vast and heavy moving beneath them. One of the guards shouted that the basement was collapsing, but no one could move. It was as if an invisible force held them trapped there, forced to watch as Isadora continued her chant. When the roar reached its peak, the lights went out completely, plunging the asylum into oppressive darkness. In the silence that followed, only the heavy breathing of those present could be heard. Then, slowly, a faint light began to shine around Isadora, emanating from the symbols themselves. When the lights of the asylum finally returned, Isadora was lying on the floor, motionless but alive. The basement, however, was different. No visible symbols remained, but the space felt larger, deeper, as if the walls had expanded. No one dared to explore further at that moment. The doctors and guards present hastily abandoned the basement, taking Isadora back to her cell, but she did not react. Her eyes remained open, empty, as if her mind were lost forever. The silence that engulfed Asylum Blackwood after the 17th night was more than just an absence of sound. It was a dense, suffocating void, as if the very space had been stripped of any trace of vitality. This emptiness seemed to emanate from Isadora, who had been returned to her cell. She lay on the bed, motionless, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. She did not blink, did not speak, but there was something in her presence that was impossible to ignore. It was not her who occupied that space, but something she carried, something that seemed to hover over everyone who approached. The staff avoided mentioning what they had witnessed in the basement. The words could not capture the horror they had felt, and even if they could, none of them seemed willing to share the weight of that knowledge. Each carried their part, like a fragment of an unbearable truth, slowly corroding them. The following morning, when the doctors entered to examine her, Isadora did not move. Her body had changed again. Her pale skin now appeared translucent, revealing veins that pulsed with a faint glow, as if a slow, alien fire burned beneath her surface. They watched in silence, unsure how to document what they were seeing, their breathing heavy and tremulous. The notes made about that morning were fragmented, as if the hand's writing could not hold the pens firmly. Catatonic state, the records said. Glowing veins, inexplicable anomaly. But the truth was that no one knew what they were seeing. Only one thing was certain. The basement of the asylum, which had once been a forgotten storage space, was now something completely different. Guards and nurses refused to go down, even during the day. The lights there never seemed to fully illuminate the space, and the sounds coming from the depths were hard to ignore. Heavy footsteps that seemed to walk in circles, muffled voices whispering incomprehensible words, and, occasionally, the sound of something scratching the walls, as if it wanted to get out. Although the symbols drawn by Isadora had disappeared, it seemed that the very basement was now marked. The walls emanated a sense of presence, as if they were watching anyone who dared to approach. Those who passed near the entrance reported nausea and headaches, while others described shadows in the corners of their vision. Shadows that were never really there when they looked directly. In Isadora's cell, time seemed to have lost all meaning. Clocks stopped inexplicably, and the lights flickered frequently, especially when someone tried to enter. During one examination, a doctor, overcoming his fear, tried to record her heartbeat. He pressed the stethoscope against the young woman's chest, but heard nothing. When he lifted his eyes, he found hers fixed on him for the first time since the incident. "It's here now," she murmured, almost inaudibly, but the weight of her words seemed to fill the space like a scream. The doctor left the cell with trembling hands, his eyes wide like someone who had looked directly into the abyss. He resigned the same day. Before leaving, he made a final note in the medical record: "We cannot stop it. Just pray it never comes out." Asylum Blackwood began to disintegrate, not physically, but in spirit. What had once been a place of controlled despair became a fertile ground for chaos. Patients screamed every night, describing hooded figures watching through the cracks of their cells. Some staff members began to disappear without a trace, especially during the night shift, and the few who remained reported a constant feeling of being watched, even when alone. Isadora was transferred to a more secure wing, but her presence seemed to transcend the walls. It was as if what she carried was not confined to her body, but permeated the very asylum. The doctors, although aware that keeping her alive was a threat, could not decide what to do. No one dared to admit aloud that whatever she was, it was beyond their control. In the last entry recorded in the medical file, one of the doctors wrote, "Isadora is no longer human. She is a portal, a link, and whatever is on the other side is waiting." In the years that followed, former staff reported recurring dreams. They were in the basement, trapped in the same pulsating space of incandescent symbols. Isadora stood at the center, motionless, but with her eyes fixed on them. She did not speak, but the message was clear. Everyone knew, deep down, that the voices from the abyss were waiting. It was only a matter of time before they came to claim what was theirs. The Asylum Blackwood is not just a building. It is a parasite, an organism that feeds on weaknesses, a portal that breathes and pulses with secrets that should never have been touched. What happened to Isadora Marchesi was not a case, nor a coincidence. It was an invitation, an opening to something that does not belong to our world. She was not just a patient. She was the catalyst, the key that turned in the lock of a fate that everyone would prefer to forget. The basement, now sealed, is not a dead space. It is a womb that pulses with the energy of the ritual, a wound that breathes in the foundation of the asylum. The voices that whispered to Isadora have not disappeared. They wait, with insane patience, for the seal to weaken, for human curiosity or arrogance to be enough to reopen the door. The survivors of this place do not speak of what they saw. They carry silence like a cross, and in the eyes of those who dared to remember, there is something broken, something that can never be repaired. The true terror is not what happened to Isadora. It is what she left behind. The basement, now still, is a pause, not an end. The voices have not fallen silent. They call. They invite. They lurk around you. The Asylum Blackwood is not over. It waits. It never forgets. And you? Will you listen to the whispers?